The winter of 1463 came to the Scottish Highlands like an iron fist closing around stone. Castle Ravenscroft sat on the northern cliffs where the wind cut through mail and leather, with the precision of a well-honed blade, and Lord Garrett Ravenscroft stood in his war room, studying maps that refused to make sense. 48 years of life had carved deep lines into his face, each one earned through blood or betrayal, or the grinding weight of a crown he'd never wanted. The late afternoon light filtered through narrow windows, turning the dust motes into suspended gold, and somewhere 3 floors below, a blacksmith's hammer rang against steel in steady rhythm that matched the pulse behind his eyes. 9 years since he'd taken the throne. 9 years of discovering that every decision left someone dead or broken, that mercy could be weakness and strength could be tyranny, and the line between them shifted like smoke. The documents spread before him showed troop movements along the French border, supply routes through territory that belonged to lords whose loyalty changed with the seasons, and a gap in the intelligence reports that made his gut tighten with old familiar dread. Something was missing. Someone was lying. After 3 decades of military service, he'd learned to trust that instinct more than any sworn oath. The door opened without ceremony. Knight Commander Arya crossed the threshold with the economy of movement that came from 40 years of wearing armor, her scarred face impassive as weathered oak. She'd lost the left eye at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, gained a limp from an ambush near Bordeaux, and remained the only person in this castle Garrett trusted without reservation. Her voice came flat and professional. Border Patrol reports a mercenary company at the northern checkpoint. 20 men well armed claiming they seek employment as castle guard. Garrett kept his gaze on the maps. We're not hiring. Their captain asked specifically about the master-at-arms position. Says he heard old Marcus took an arrow in that last skirmish. That made him look up. Marcus had died 3 weeks ago, information that hadn't traveled beyond the castle walls. Garrett had kept it quiet precisely to see who would come sniffing around the vacancy, what rats might crawl from the woodwork when they sensed opportunity. A mercenary captain with accurate intelligence was either very good at his trade or working for someone who was. What does he look like? Arya's mouth twitched the closest she came to smiling. Like a man who spent 20 years killing people for money and got good at it. 40-ish. Moves like infantry, thinks like cavalry. Brought his own horse military saddle weapons that cost more than a mercenary should afford. Name? Calls himself Elias Winters. Says he served the crown in France and Scotland, border campaigns mostly. Has the scars to prove it. Garrett turned back to the maps mind, already working through possibilities. A skilled veteran showing up at precisely the right moment with precisely the right credentials. Too convenient. Too clean. Which meant either genuine opportunity or elaborate trap, and after 9 years wearing a crown, he knew which way to bet. Bring him to me, alone, and have the third company ready in the courtyard. Arya left without acknowledgement. That was another thing he valued. She never questioned orders, never demanded explanations, simply executed commands with the brutal efficiency of a siege engine. Garrett moved to the window, watching snow begin to fall across the training yard below. Young knights practice formations, their movements still rough, lacking the polish that only came from watching friends die beside you. He remembered being that young, once believing that skill and honor mattered more than politics and gold. The memory felt like something that had happened to someone else. 20 minutes later, boots echoed in the corridor outside. The door opened and Arya stepped through, followed by a man who made Garrett's tactical mind catalog details with automatic precision, 42, maybe 43 years old. Broad shoulders under a worn traveling cloak. Leather armor beneath that showed quality craftsmanship despite road dust and weather damage. A long sword hung at his left hip, balanced by a fighting dagger on the right configuration that marked him as trained, ambidextrous, rare skill that required years of dedicated practice. His face carried the particular weathering that came from sleeping under stars and marching through rain, with a thin scar running from left temple to jaw that spoke of a blade that had come within inches of ending him. But it was the eyes that held Garrett's attention. Dark, steady, measuring everything in the room with the systematic assessment of someone who'd learned to identify exits and threats before bothering with pleasantries. Not a mercenary's eyes. Something else. Something disciplined and cold and very, very dangerous. The man inclined his head with military precision. Your Majesty, I'm told you have need of a master at arms. The voice carried education beneath the roughness. Not nobility, wrong accent, wrong cadence, but formal training somewhere. Grammar too precise for a common soldier vocabulary, too extensive for someone who'd spent 20 years in mercenary camps. Garrett kept his face neutral, letting silence stretch until most men would feel compelled to fill it. This one simply waited patient as a hunter at a deer trail. What makes you qualified? 20 years in Crown service, infantry, cavalry, siege operations. Served under Lord Marshal Pembroke in France, Captain Drake in the Scottish campaigns, and spent 3 years with the 3rd Intelligence Division before they disbanded. That stopped Garrett cold. The 3rd Intelligence Division had been his command back when he'd been nothing but a captain with a gift for tactics and a willingness to do the Crown's dirty work in shadows. He trained those men personally, teaching them to fight with every weapon from garrote wire to political leverage. The division had been dissolved when his father died, and Garrett inherited a throne instead of a battlefield. He studied the stranger with new intensity, searching for recognition. The age was right. This man would have been in his early 20s when Garrett ran the 3rd Division, young enough to train, old enough to remember. But 15 years and hard living, changed faces wore away the markers that made someone recognizable. If they'd served together, Garrett couldn't place him. The 3rd Division didn't hire mercenaries. No, Your Majesty, we recruited from regular infantry, soldiers who showed aptitude for tactics and intelligence work. The words came carefully neutral, but something flickered behind those eyes. Memory, perhaps, or calculation. Garrett moved to the weapons rack along the wall, selected a practiced longsword with a weighted blade designed to mimic real steel. He tossed it across the room. The stranger caught it one-handed without looking, letting the momentum carry through into a fighter's ready stance. Blade angled down and to the left, weight balanced on the balls of his feet, shoulders loose. 3rd Division stance. Garrett had taught that position to 40 men over 3 years, hammering it into muscle memory until they could assume it drunk or exhausted or half dead from blood loss. Show me. What followed confirmed every suspicion. The stranger moved through attack sequences with the fluid precision of someone who had drilled the movements 10,000 times until thought and action merged into pure reflex. He didn't fight like a mercenary, aggressive, overwhelming, burning energy to end things fast. He fought like intelligence operatives fought, conserving strength, probing for weaknesses, adjusting tactics with each exchange. Garrett recognized combinations he'd invented, himself specific footwork patterns he'd never seen anyone use outside his own trained soldiers. After 5 minutes, Garrett raised his hand. The stranger lowered his blade immediately, breathing controlled, despite the exertion. No hesitation, no questioning the command. Military discipline ran bone deep in this one. Where did you learn those combinations? 3rd Intelligence Division, Your Majesty. Like I said, I trained the 3rd Division personally. Every man who served there I knew by name and by face. Garrett let the statement hang between them, watching for reaction. I don't know you. The stranger held his gaze without flinching. Perhaps Your Majesty had more important things to remember than one junior operative among 40. It was 15 years ago. Men change. Truth in that, Garrett himself barely recognized the man he'd been at 33 before the weight of a kingdom settled onto shoulders that had only ever been meant to carry a sword. Before he'd learned that ruling meant choosing which people to sacrifice instead of which battles to fight. Before he discovered that the men he trusted most were often the ones destroying him from within. He studied the stranger's face, searching for something familiar beneath the scars and weathering. Nothing came. But the tactics didn't lie. This man had trained under Garrett's command, had learned the specific techniques that made 3rd Division operatives the most effective killers in 3 kingdoms. Which meant either he was telling the truth about his service, or someone had taught him those skills for a very specific purpose. What's your real business here, Winters? And I'd advise against lying. I've gotten very good at detecting it. Something shifted in the man's expression. Not fear, calculation, weighing risks, measuring consequences, deciding how much truth to offer and how much to keep buried. Garrett recognized the process because he did it himself 20 times a day, every time someone asked a question that mattered. The stranger's voice came quieter, harder. I'm here because the master-at-arms position gives me access to castle records in council meetings. Because I need to investigate something that happened 5 years ago, and I need proximity to do it properly. Honest, at least. Foolishly honest, perhaps admitting infiltration to the man he was infiltrating. Unless honesty itself was the tactic confessing to a lesser crime to hide a greater one, offering truth as distraction from deeper deception. Garrett had used that technique himself more times than he could count. What happened 5 years ago? Your Majesty executed a man for treason, High Chancellor Thomas Thornwood, charged with embezzlement and conspiracy, convicted on testimony from 4 witnesses, sentenced and executed within 2 weeks of arrest. The words came flat, reciting facts without emotion. I believe the charges were fabricated. I believe the evidence was manufactured. And I believe whoever framed him is still here, still in power, still manipulating Your Majesty's judgments. The floor seemed to shift beneath Garrett's feet. Thomas Thornwood. God's blood, he remembered that case with brutal clarity. His former comrade in arms, the man who'd fought beside him in a dozen campaigns, who'd been one of 3 people Garrett had trusted without reservation after inheriting the crown. The evidence had been overwhelming. Signed confessions, financial records showing systematic theft, multiple witnesses placing Thomas at meetings with French agents. The trial had lasted 3 days, and the verdict had been unanimous. Garrett had signed the execution order himself, watched Thomas die on the scaffold, and spent the next 5 years trying to forget the look of betrayal in his old friend's eyes. If that conviction had been false, if Thomas had been innocent, Garrett forced his voice steady. What evidence do you have that Lord Thornwood was framed? Right now, suspicions and timeline discrepancies. One of the witnesses claimed to see him meeting with French agents on August 15th. But your own military records show Thomas was in Scotland that week accompanying Crown forces on border inspection. Your Majesty signed the travel warrant personally. Ice spread through Garrett's chest. He remembered that border inspection, a tense week negotiating with Scottish lords while keeping French spies from turning the whole region into a battlefield. Thomas had been there offering tactical advice, helping navigate political landmines with the diplomatic skill that made him invaluable as Chancellor. There was no possible way Thomas could have been meeting French agents 300 miles south while riding beside Garrett's own horse through Highland passes, which meant the witness had lied, which meant the testimony was fabricated, which meant Garrett moved to his desk with careful control, pulling out the locked drawer where he kept cases that still haunted him. The Thornwood file sat near the top, parchment yellowed with age, ink slightly faded, but words still clear enough to condemn a man. He'd reviewed this file 100 times over 5 years, searching for something he'd missed, some detail that would explain the hollow feeling in his gut every time he thought about his friend's execution. The travel warrant was there exactly where it should be. Garrett's own seal pressed into red wax, his signature authorizing Thomas Thornwood to accompany the King's forces to Scotland, dated August 10th through August 23rd, which made Lady Vivienne at Ashmore's testimony claiming that she'd witnessed Thomas meeting French agents on August 15th a physical impossibility. His hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against the desk, forcing steadiness through pure will. 5 years. 5 years he'd carried the weight of executing an innocent man, and he hadn't seen it because he'd trusted the evidence, trusted the witnesses, trusted the system that was supposed to protect against exactly this kind of corruption. When he finally looked up, the stranger was watching him with an expression Garrett couldn't quite read. Not triumph, something closer to shared pain, the recognition of someone else who'd been carrying an unbearable weight for far too long. Who are you really? The man's jaw tightened. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with the air of someone stepping off a cliff, Captain Elias Thornwood, Thomas Thornwood's son, and I've spent 5 years trying to find evidence that would clear my father's name. The world snapped into sudden terrible focus. Garrett saw it now, the resemblance he'd missed, the shape of the eyes and the set of the jaw that matched the man he'd executed. Thomas had mentioned a son serving somewhere in the military, rising through the ranks with the same tactical brilliance his father had shown. Garrett had never met the boy, never thought to wonder what happened to him after the execution. Nobles' families were usually stripped of title and wealth when the patriarch fell, scattered to minor houses, or worse. And here stood that son, 20 years of military training, turned into a weapon aimed at uncovering the truth about his father's death. Brave or suicidal, Garrett couldn't decide which. Probably both. He should arrest this man, call the guards, throw him in the dungeon, extract every detail of his investigation before deciding whether to execute him or exile him, or simply make him disappear, like so many other problems had disappeared over 9 years of ruling. That was what a practical king would do, what his advisors would recommend. What Lord Ravenscar himself had taught him: eliminate threats before they could metastasize into rebellion. Instead, Garrett heard himself saying, "I executed your father. Why would you expect me to help you prove he was innocent?" "Because your majesty spent 3 hours reviewing that case file before signing the execution order." Elias's voice carried certainty, not accusation. "Because you insisted on personally verifying every piece of evidence before condemning a man you'd fought beside for 15 years. Because you're not the kind of king who executes people carelessly." A pause. "And because I think you've suspected the truth for a while now, you just didn't know how to prove it." Garrett moved to the window, staring out at the snow-covered training yard where young knights still drilled in fading light. He should feel angry at this infiltration, this manipulation, this calculated approach designed to exploit his guilt about an execution that haunted him. Instead, he felt something closer to relief, the possibility that his instincts hadn't failed him, that Thomas truly had been the loyal friend he'd believed him to be, that the hollow sickness Garrett felt every time he remembered that execution had been justified after all. But relief came tangled with rage. If Thomas had been innocent, then someone in this castle had framed him. Someone with enough access to forge evidence, enough authority to coordinate multiple witnesses, enough trust that Garrett had never questioned their involvement. The list of people who fit that description was terrifyingly short. "You've been investigating for 5 years. What else have you found?" Elias moved to stand beside him at the window, careful to keep distance between them. Military protocol still governing his movements despite the collapse of his cover. "Financial records that are too clean. Real embezzlement leaves gaps and errors. These accounts show systematic perfection, every discrepancy, explained every transaction documented." It's the kind of thoroughness that comes from building a false narrative instead of recording actual crimes. Who would have the access to create those records? Someone in the Treasury, someone who understands accounting well enough to forge believable documents. Someone who's been in position long enough to make alterations without raising suspicion. Garrett's mind cataloged possibilities with mechanical efficiency. The current master of coin had only held the position for 3 years, appointed after his predecessor died of plague. But before that, the position had been held by Lord Ravenscar for nearly a decade before Garrett promoted him to chief advisor and gave him oversight of all crown operations. Victor Ravenscar, who had been his father's closest friend, who'd guided Garrett through the first years of kingship, who'd been present at every major decision, including Thomas Thornwood's trial. No, impossible. Victor had been training Garrett in statecraft and intelligence work since he was 19 years old, teaching him to think tactically about governance, to see patterns others missed, to identify threats before they materialized. Victor was the one person Garrett trusted more than Arya, the only advisor who'd never steered him wrong, who'd helped him become something better than his brutal father had been. But Thomas had also been someone Garrett trusted completely. And Thomas had died because that trust made Garrett blind to manufactured evidence. "I need to see your father's original case file, the complete version including evidence submitted but not presented at trial." Elias nodded slowly. "That's in the archives tower vault. Heavily guarded, restricted access." "I'm the king, I have access." Garrett turned from the window, decision crystallizing with the cold clarity that came from 3 decades of making hard choices. "But if we're going to investigate this properly, we need operational security. No one can know what we're doing until we have evidence that can't be destroyed or discredited. Your Majesty is going to help me investigate." Surprise colored Elias's voice for the first time. "If your father was innocent, then someone in my government framed him, used me as a weapon to execute an innocent man." Garrett met his gaze directly, letting him see the cold rage building behind carefully maintained control. "That person will pay for it, but we do this my way, with military precision and complete compartmentalization. No one outside this room knows about your real identity or our investigation. You'll serve as master-at-arms, and that will give you legitimate access to castle operations while we gather evidence." "What about Knight Commander Arya?" "Arya fought beside your father at Stirling Bridge. She was there when he saved my life during the Bordeaux ambush." Garrett's voice went rough with memory. "If Thomas was murdered on false charges, she'll want justice as much as we do. but no one else. The conspiracy had to involve multiple people, witnesses, forgers, someone coordinating testimony. Until we know the full extent, we trust no one. Elias extended his hand with the formality of a military pact. Garrett gripped it, feeling calluses that matched his own, the shared markers of men who'd spent their lives holding weapons. Brothers in arms, perhaps, or at least soldiers fighting the same enemy, which in Garrett's experience was close enough. One condition, Your Majesty. Name it. When we find who did this, when we have proof they framed my father, I want to be there when you pass judgment. I want to see their face when they realize they've been caught. Agreed. But Elias, if we're going to work together on this, stop calling me Your Majesty when we're alone. In private, I'm Garrett, just another soldier trying to do his duty. Something flickered in Elias's expression, surprise, maybe gratitude, possibly suspicion. After 5 years of planning, this infiltration, trust probably didn't come easily. Garrett understood. He'd spent 9 years learning that trust was the most dangerous weapon anyone could wield against you. They spent the next hour reviewing evidence, spreading documents across the war room table with systematic thoroughness. Garrett pulled everything he had on the Thornwood case, while Elias produced notes he'd been compiling for years, timeline discrepancies, financial irregularities, patterns in testimony that suggested coordination rather than independent observation. The picture that emerged was damning in its consistency. Someone had built an airtight case against Thomas Thornwood with the professional precision of an intelligence operation, leaving no obvious gaps while creating one fundamental flaw: the impossibility of Thomas being in two places at once. As sunset painted the war room walls orange and gold, Arya returned with her customary lack of ceremony. She stopped in the doorway when she saw the scattered documents, her remaining eye narrowing as she assessed the situation with veteran's instinct for trouble. "Should I come back?" Garrett gestured her inside, waiting until she closed the door before speaking. "Arya, do you remember Captain Elias Thornwood from the 3rd Intelligence Division?" She studied Elias with professional intensity, cataloging details, comparing memory to reality. "Quiet one, asked good questions. Left the division to serve with regular forces when his father got appointed to High Council." Her gaze shifted to Garrett. "Why are we discussing 15-year-old personnel records?" "Because Captain Thornwood just spent 5 years infiltrating my castle to investigate his father's execution." Garrett kept his voice level, watching her reaction. "And because I think he's right about Thomas being innocent." Arya's face went very still. After several heartbeats, she moved to the table, examining the documents with the same systematic attention she brought to tactical briefings. Her finger traced the travel warrant, then moved to Lady Vivienne's testimony, comparing dates with mechanical precision. When she finally looked up, fury burned behind the scarred terrain of her features. 5 years. We've been operating for 5 years with a traitor in the council. Someone who can manufacture evidence, convincing enough to fool you. She directed this at Garrett without softening it. How many other judgments were compromised? How many other executions were based on lies? The question struck like a blade between the ribs. Garrett had signed 47 execution orders in 9 years of ruling. He remembered every name, every face, every crime that justified the sentence. But if one had been based on fabricated evidence, how many others might have been similarly tainted? The thought made his stomach twist with nausea that had nothing to do with the evening meal he'd skipped. "That's what we need to determine. Quietly, carefully, without alerting whoever built this conspiracy." He gestured to the documents. "Captain Thornwood has been investigating for 5 years. We're going to finish what he started using proper intelligence methodology and complete operational security." Arya nodded, once crisp and military. "What do you need?" "Access to the Tower Archive's original trial records for every execution I've ordered. We're going to review them all, look for patterns, identify any other cases with similar inconsistencies." "That's 47 cases. Going to take weeks to review properly." "Then we'd better start immediately." Garrett straightened, feeling the familiar weight of command settle across his shoulders, transforming personal rage into tactical focus. This was what he knew how to do. Break a problem into manageable pieces, assign objectives, execute with precision. "Arya, you'll handle archive access. Take what we need, replace it with copies so no one notices the original's missing. Elias, you'll conduct preliminary review, flag anything that raises questions. I'll verify your findings and cross-reference with my memory of each case. What about the rest of the council? Elias's voice carried appropriate caution. They'll expect you to consult them on major decisions. Let them expect. I've been king for 9 years. I'm allowed to review old cases without seeking permission. Garrett allowed himself a thin smile, though it felt like baring teeth. Besides, whoever framed Thomas is probably on that council. I want them comfortable and complacent while we build our case. The moment they sense investigation, they'll start destroying evidence. They worked until full darkness fell and candles became necessary, mapping out a systematic approach to the investigation. Arya left first, disappearing into the castle's shadows with the ghost-like movement that made her an excellent scout despite the limp. Elias remained ostensibly to discuss his new duties as master-at-arms, but actually to coordinate operational details, times for clandestine meetings, signals for emergencies, protocols for passing information without detection. As midnight approached, Garrett found himself studying the younger man with reluctant respect. Elias had spent 5 years building this infiltration, maintaining his cover, while gathering evidence, risking execution if discovered. That kind of discipline and patience marked him as genuine intelligence operative, not merely soldier playing spy. Thomas had trained his son well before dying on a scaffold for crimes he hadn't committed. Why military service instead of trying to clear your father's name through legal channels? Elias was quiet for several heartbeats. Because I was 22 years old when they executed him. Noble birth, but no title after his conviction, no money, no connections, no proof beyond a son's certainty that his father was innocent. Legal channels require power or wealth or evidence, and I had none of those. He met Garrett's gaze directly. So I went where I could gain skills that might help someday. Military service, intelligence training, tactical expertise. Spent 5 years becoming someone useful enough that a king might listen to me. And if I hadn't listened, if I'd thrown you in the dungeon the moment you revealed yourself, then I'd have died trying, same as my father did. No drama in the words, just flat acceptance of consequences. Some things are worth dying for. Truth, justice, making sure the people who destroyed my family face judgment for it. Garrett recognized that particular brand of cold determination. He'd felt it himself when his father died and left him a kingdom rotting from within, built on fear and brutality and systematic corruption. Cleaning that rot had required making enemies of powerful lords who'd profited from his father's cruelty, restructuring systems that had existed for generations, risking assassination or rebellion with every reform. But some things were worth the risk. Some battles had to be fought regardless of cost. He stood fatigued, pulling at muscles that protested the day's exertions. 48 felt older than it should, carrying the weight of 9 years' worth of decisions and consequences, and corpses that visited dreams he didn't remember upon waking. Get some rest, Captain. Tomorrow, you start training the third company. I want them proficient in defensive formations by the end of the week. We've been sloppy about castle security, and if there's a conspiracy operating inside these walls, we need to be ready for escalation. Elias rose as well, military bearing returning automatically. Yes, Your Majesty. Garrett, I told you when we're alone I'm just another soldier. With respect, you're never just another soldier. You're the king. And even if you weren't, you'd still be the man who taught me half of what I know about tactics and intelligence work. Something shifted in Elias's expression. Vulnerability breaking through professional control. You're also the man who executed my father on false evidence. So forgive me if I need a little distance while we figure out who the real enemy is. Fair enough. Trust had to be earned, especially when complicated by history that left blood on everyone's hands. Garrett nodded acceptance and watched Elias leave, boots echoing in the corridor outside until silence reclaimed the war room. Alone, he moved to the window overlooking the northern valley. Snow fell heavier now, covering the landscape in deceptive purity that hid the rocks and thorn bushes underneath. Somewhere in this castle, someone had framed Thomas Thornwood with enough skill to fool a king who'd been trained in intelligence operations, who'd spent 3 decades learning to detect deception. That person had been operating for at least 5 years, possibly longer, using Garrett's authority to eliminate threats while keeping their own hands clean. Lord Ravenscar's face rose unbidden in his mind. Victor, who'd been father's best friend, who'd guided Garrett through the transition from soldier to king, who'd taught him that mercy without strength was weakness, and strength without mercy was tyranny. Victor, who'd been present at every critical decision, who had access to every document and witness and piece of evidence that shaped royal judgments. No, he was letting suspicion poison memory, seeing shadows where there were only old friendships tested by time and duty. Victor had saved his life twice, once in battle and once in politics, when younger lords tried to undermine his early rule. Victor had never asked for anything except the chance to serve, never sought power beyond what Garrett freely granted. Suspecting him now, without evidence beyond proximity and access, was the kind of paranoia that destroyed kings from within. But Thomas had been innocent, and someone had framed him. That person was skilled patient and close enough to Garrett's operations to manipulate evidence without detection. The list of people who fit that description included Victor Ravenscar, whether Garrett wanted to admit it or not. He stood at the window until the candles burned low, and exhaustion made thought difficult. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of a systematic investigation that might tear his government apart. Tonight he allowed himself the luxury of stillness, of watching snow cover the world in temporary grace, before morning forced him back into the machinery of justice and vengeance and whatever terrible truths waited to be uncovered. 3 floors below, in a small room assigned to the master-at-arms, Elias Thornwood sat on a narrow bed and permitted himself the first moment of hope he'd felt in 5 years. The king believed him, more than believed, was actively joining the investigation, bringing resources and authority that Elias could never have accessed on his own. It was more than he'd dared hope for when planning this infiltration, risking everything on the chance that Garrett might listen, instead of simply having him executed as a conspirator. But hope came tangled with doubt. Garrett had signed the execution order that killed Thomas Thornwood, had stood on the scaffold and watched the blade fall, doing nothing to stop it, despite 15 years of friendship and brotherhood. 5 years of planning this confrontation, and Elias still didn't know if he was working with a king who genuinely sought justice or a monster who'd learned to disguise guilt behind tactical competence. Time would tell. Until then, he had a mission to complete and a father's memory to redeem. Everything else, trust, forgiveness, the complicated knot of anger and respect he felt toward the man who'd killed his father, could wait until justice was served. He stretched out on the bed without bothering to undress, exhaustion pulling him towards sleep despite the racing thoughts. Outside, wind howled around the stone walls that had stood for 300 years, built to withstand siege and storm and the slow erosion of time. Inside, 2 soldiers began a different kind of siege, one aimed at uncovering truth buried beneath years of deception, with consequences neither could fully predict. The investigation had begun. Dawn brought frost that turned the castle into something carved from diamond and ice. Elias stood in the training yard, watching his breath plume white, while 20 soldiers from the 3rd Company assembled with varying degrees of reluctance. Most were young, barely past their 20th year, with the soft hands and uncertain movements of men who'd seen parade drills but never actual combat. A few bore the harder edges of veteran scars and weathered faces, and the way they checked equipment with automatic thoroughness that came from expecting violence at any moment. He walked the line slowly, assessing each man with the clinical detachment his father had taught him. Weak shoulders on that one, compensating with aggressive stance. The tall one favored his right leg, old wound probably. 3 in the back row exchanged smirks, testing the new commander before deciding whether to respect or undermine him. Standard dynamics in any military unit made more complicated by the fact that Elias needed to establish authority while avoiding the kind of attention that might expose his real mission. His voice cut through morning cold with parade ground precision. Formation drills for the first hour, shield wall advance and retreat wheel maneuvers, then weapons practice. Anyone who can't keep pace will run the castle perimeter until they find the stamina. Groans rippled through the younger soldiers. The veterans simply moved into position, shields coming up with practiced economy. Elias began drilling them with the methodical intensity of someone who'd learned that sloppy formations got men killed, that discipline and practice translated to survival in combat. He pushed them hard, correcting stance and timing with sharp commands that left no room for argument, occasionally demonstrating techniques himself when words proved insufficient. By mid-morning, Knight Commander Arya appeared at the yard's edge, watching with her single eye, while Elias ran the company through defensive positions. When he called a water break, she approached with the unhurried stride of someone whose authority required no announcement. Tower archives, midnight. Use the east stairwell, fewer guards, and the ones there owe me favors. Her voice stayed low-pitched for his ears alone. Bring writing materials and a good memory. We'll have maybe 2 hours before shift change. Elias nodded fractionally, accepting the information without visible reaction. Around them, soldiers drank from water skins and complained about the pace exhaustion, making them oblivious to the quiet exchange happening 15 feet away. Good. This was how intelligence operations worked. Mundane cover obscuring critical coordination, important messages passed in moments too brief for observers to notice anything beyond routine interaction. Arya left without further conversation. Elias returned to drilling his company, pushing them through advanced maneuvers. They weren't ready for building the kind of bone-deep fatigue that would send them to bed early and sleep heavily. He needed them unconscious and undisturbed when he slipped out for the midnight archive run. The afternoon brought unexpected complications in the form of Lord Victor Ravenscar himself appearing in the training yard with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to deference. 64 years had left silver in his hair, but strength in his frame, and he moved with the careful grace of aging nobility who refused to acknowledge decline. His black robes marked him as chief advisor, and the gold chain of office around his neck caught winter sunlight with cold gleam. Captain Winters, His Majesty speaks highly of your tactical expertise. The words came warm and friendly, but Victor's eyes conducted their own assessment, measuring Elias with the attention of someone trained to identify threats. I wanted to meet the man who will be training our castle guard. Elias kept his expression neutral, fighting the urge to search Victor's face for signs of guilt or deception. This was the man who might have framed his father, who might have orchestrated 5 years of lies and false evidence. But suspicion without proof was useless, and showing emotion now would only raise questions about why a newly hired master-at-arms cared so deeply about ancient cases. My lord, I'm honored by His Majesty's confidence. He fell back on military formality, the safest mask available. The third company has potential. Give me 3 months and they'll be respectable. His Majesty values competence. We've had difficulties in recent years. Men appointed for political connections rather than skill. Victor's smile carried self-deprecation. I've urged him repeatedly to prioritize ability over bloodline, but old habits persist. Your appointment suggests he's finally listening. Carefully crafted words designed to establish Victor as ally and reformer, positioning himself on the side of meritocracy and effective governance. Classic political manipulation: present yourself as reasonable voice of progress and make the target feel like you share their values and frustrations. Elias recognized the technique because Garrett had taught it to the 3rd Intelligence Division, explaining how to build rapport with potential assets by mirroring their concerns. Change takes time, my lord, especially in institutions as old as this one. Indeed. Though sometimes change requires more than time, it requires willingness to make hard decisions, to remove obstacles regardless of personal cost. Something flickered in Victor's expression, gone too quickly to interpret. His Majesty learned that lesson young, when he had to clean house after inheriting his father's corrupted court. Painful but necessary. The conversation felt like verbal fencing, each statement carrying multiple possible meanings, testing whether Elias would reveal anything beyond surface-level military professionalism. He kept his responses bland and appropriate, offering nothing that might indicate his real purpose, while cataloging every detail of Victor's demeanor for later analysis. After 10 minutes of careful probing disguised as welcoming small talk, Victor departed with reminders to contact him if Elias needed anything. The encounter left Elias unsettled in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Nothing Victor said had been overtly suspicious, but the whole interaction carried an undertone of assessment, as if Victor had been determining whether this new master-at-arms represented threat or opportunity. Evening found Elias alone in his quarters, reviewing notes and preparing for the midnight archive infiltration. A knock interrupted his work, sharp and military rather than the servant's tentative tap. He opened the door to find Garrett wearing plain clothes instead of royal regalia, looking more like a veteran soldier than a king. Walk with me. They moved through castle corridors with apparent casualness, 2 men engaged in conversation about guard rotations and defensive preparations. Anyone observing would see King consulting with his new military commander, nothing remarkable or suspicious. But Garrett's words carried different weight, spoken low enough that passing servants caught only fragments. I've been reviewing cases from the first year of my reign. 3 executions for treason, all based primarily on witness testimony with minimal physical evidence. Same pattern as your father's trial, multiple coordinated witnesses, financial records that were suspiciously thorough, timeline issues that weren't caught during initial review. Elias felt cold spread through his chest. 3 cases. That's not isolated incident, that's systematic operation. Exactly what I thought. And all 3 defendants were investigating Treasury irregularities before being accused of crimes that conveniently ended those investigations. Garrett's jaw tightened. I executed 3 innocent men in my first year as king before I developed enough experience to question the evidence being presented. They reached the battlements emerging into cold night air, where wind made conversation difficult for anyone trying to eavesdrop. Below them, the castle sprawled across its cliff like a sleeping beast, lights flickering in windows where servants completed evening duties. Beyond the walls, darkness swallowed the landscape until nothing existed except stone and sky, and the 2 men standing guard against enemies who wore friendly faces. Who presented the evidence in those cases? Victor Ravenscar served as prosecutor in 2 of them. The third was handled by Lord Chancellor Pembroke, who died the following year, fell from his horse during a routine ride, broke his neck. Garrett stared into darkness. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Pembroke was 68 years old, accidents happen. But now I'm wondering if it was accident at all. How many people has this conspiracy killed? I don't know, that's what terrifies me. Garrett's voice went rough. 9 years I've been signing execution orders, making judgments, trusting advisors who brought me evidence and testimony. How many of those decisions were based on truth, and how many were weapons someone aimed through me at their own enemies? Elias understood the weight crushing down on Garrett's shoulders. This was worse than discovering a single false conviction. This was uncovering systematic corruption that turned a king into an unwitting instrument of murder. Every execution Garrett had ordered now carried shadow of doubt, every judgment tainted by possibility that he'd been manipulated into serving someone else's agenda. We find proof, build airtight case, then we tear the whole conspiracy out by the roots. Elias kept his voice steady, offering tactical clarity to counter Garrett's emotional turmoil. 1 step at a time, using intelligence methodology. Tonight I get the original files from the archives. We analyze them for patterns, identify the common elements that connect these cases. Then we trace those elements back to whoever's orchestrating it all. Garrett nodded slowly, control reasserting itself over fear and guilt. Arya will meet you at midnight. I've arranged for the tower guards to be called away for exactly 90 minutes. Border Patrol reported suspicious activity, requires immediate response, conveniently scheduled to coincide with your archive access. His mouth twisted into something that might have been smile under different circumstances. Fabricating crises is surprisingly easy when you're king. I should be more disturbed by that. They stood in silence for several minutes, 2 soldiers watching the darkness and thinking about the battles ahead. Finally, Garrett spoke again, voice carrying weight of command, despite the informal setting. Elias, if we find proof that Victor is behind this. He stopped, seeming to wrestle with words that refused to come easily. He's been like a father to me. Guided me through the worst years of my life, taught me everything I know about governance and strategy. If he's the one who framed your father, who's been manipulating me for 9 years, who turned me into a weapon against innocent people. The sentence died unfinished. Elias waited, understanding that some truths were too painful to speak directly. Can you do what needs doing? If it comes down to it, can you put justice ahead of whatever complicated feelings you have about the man who murdered your father? The question landed with unexpected force. Elias had spent 5 years focused on clearing his father's name, on exposing the conspiracy and seeing justice served, but he hadn't fully considered what justice would look like in practice. Watching Garrett order the execution of the man who'd been his mentor, his guide, his surrogate father. There would be no satisfaction in that kind of victory, only the grim recognition that corruption had destroyed multiple families and left scars that would never fully heal. I can do what's necessary. Can you? Garrett was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat certainty of someone who'd already made the hard choice. I've ordered 47 executions in 9 years. If number 48 is the man who made all the others necessary, then yes, I can do what's necessary. They parted with military efficiency, Garrett returning to his chambers while Elias prepared for the midnight infiltration. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness, each minute stretching into eternity, as Elias waited for the castle to settle into deep night quiet. He checked his equipment 3 times, lockpicks, writing materials, flint and steel for reading, by candlelight, a thin blade concealed in his boot in case things went catastrophically wrong. At quarter to midnight, he slipped from his room and moved through darkened corridors with the practiced silence of someone who'd spent years conducting covert operations. The east stairwell waited exactly where Arya had indicated its entrance, hidden behind a tapestry depicting some ancient battle. He found her there, already dressed in dark clothing that made her nearly invisible against the shadows. She handed him a ring of keys without speaking, then led the way up the spiral stairs with confident steps that suggested she'd made this climb many times before. 3 floors up, past the inhabited levels where nobles slept, into the tower sections used primarily for storage and archives. Dust coated everything, disturbed only by occasional servant visits and the rare scholar seeking historical documents. The archive vault waited behind an iron-banded door that looked strong enough to withstand siege. Arya selected a key from the ring and worked the lock with practiced efficiency, mechanisms clicking open with sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the midnight silence. The door swung inward on oiled hinges. Someone maintained this vault carefully despite its apparent disuse. Inside, shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, packed with leather-bound volumes and wooden document boxes. Years of accumulated records, everything from tax receipts to trial transcripts to military campaign reports. The smell of old parchment and ink filled the space, overlaid with hints of mildew and the particular mustiness that came from undisturbed air. Arya moved to the section marked with royal seal and dates spanning the last decade. Her finger traced along spines until finding the boxes, labeled with years, matching the cases Garrett had identified. She pulled them down and set them on a reading table, then produced candles and struck them to life with flint and steel. 90 minutes, I'll keep watch at the stairs. She moved toward the door, then paused. Captain Thornwood, your father was a good man. If someone framed him, if they used him as example to frighten others into silence about treasury corruption, her remaining eye reflected candlelight like a coal. I want them to suffer before they die. Then she was gone, leaving Elias alone with the evidence that might finally clear his father's name. He started with Thomas Thornwood's case, pulling documents from the box with hands that tried not to shake. Trial transcripts in formal court script, witness testimonies, signed and sealed, physical evidence logged and described in meticulous detail. He read through everything twice, committing key passages to memory while making careful notes about discrepancies and timeline issues. Lady Vivian Ashmore's testimony jumped out immediately, the August 15th date that contradicted military travel records. But there were other problems, too subtle or inconsistencies, that only became apparent when reading with trained eye. Her description of the alleged meeting place included architectural details that hadn't existed until renovations the following year. She claimed Thomas had worn a distinctive ring during the meeting, but inventory of his possessions at arrest showed no such ring. Small details that individually meant nothing but collectively suggested testimony based on secondhand information rather than direct observation. The financial records presented similar problems. They documented years of embezzlement with the kind of completeness that real criminals never achieved. Every transaction recorded. Every transfer documented, a paper trail so thorough it practically screamed fabrication. Genuine embezzlers left gaps and errors because they were trying to hide their activities. These records showed someone meticulously building a false narrative with enough detail to be convincing while maintaining internal consistency that real corruption would never possess. Elias moved to the other cases Garrett had mentioned, pulling their documents and laying them side by side for comparison. The pattern emerged with damning clarity. All 3 cases showed the same structural elements: multiple witnesses with coordinated testimony, financial records that were suspiciously complete, physical evidence that supposedly tied defendants to their crimes but lacked the kind of forensic detail that would survive serious scrutiny. And in every case, Lord Victor Ravenscar's signature appeared somewhere in the chain of evidence. Not always as prosecutor, sometimes as witness coordinator or evidence custodian, or the advisor who brought initial accusations to the king's attention. His involvement varied enough to avoid obvious pattern, but he was present in every case, a common thread connecting 4 executions based on manufactured proof. The revelation should have brought satisfaction. Instead, Elias felt sick weight settle in his stomach. This wasn't random corruption or isolated conspiracy. This was systematic operation, run with intelligence tradecraft by someone who understood how to manipulate institutional processes. Victor had built a machine for eliminating threats using the king's authority as cover while keeping his own hands technically clean. How many others had died this way? How many families had been destroyed? How many innocent people had gone to the scaffold because they had discovered something dangerous about Victor's activities? Elias worked faster now, pulling documents from other cases, scanning them for Victor's signature or similar patterns. He found 6 more over the span of 9 years, each showing the same careful construction of false evidence. 6 more innocent people executed because they'd gotten too close to uncovering treasury embezzlement, or questioned military supply contracts, or investigated noble houses that were secretly funneling money into Victor's network. 10 cases total. 10 people murdered through legal process, their deaths sanctioned by a king who'd been trusting the wrong advisor, who'd been weaponized against his own people by someone he considered family. Elias was photographing the final documents using the memory technique his father had taught him, creating mental images so precise he could recreate the pages later when footsteps echoed in the stairwell outside. Too early for Arya's warning signal, too heavy for her distinctive limping gait. Someone else was coming, and they were making no effort at stealth. He moved with trained speed, replacing documents in their boxes, blowing out candles, concealing his notes in the hidden pocket of his jacket. The door was already open, no time to lock it, no way to explain his presence if discovered. His hand found the blade in his boot, mind racing through options that all ended badly. Fighting his way out of a tower archive would destroy his cover and likely get him killed, but allowing capture meant interrogation and probable execution. The footsteps reached the landing outside. Elias pressed himself against the wall beside the door blade, ready, preparing to strike first and deal with consequences after. But the figure that entered wasn't guard or servant. It was Arya, moving faster than usual, her face showing tension that cut through normal military stoicism. "We have a problem." Border Patrol actually reported suspicious activity, not the fabricated crisis His Majesty arranged. He had to respond immediately or risk looking suspicious himself. Her voice stayed low and urgent. "You've got maybe 15 minutes before real guards get reassigned to tower duty." Elias worked faster, shoving boxes back onto shelves without bothering about perfect alignment, erasing signs of his presence with efficiency born from years of covert operations. Arya helped, her hands moving with practiced speed, despite the tremor that age and old injuries brought to fine motor control. They finished with minutes to spare, relocking the vault door and descending the spiral stairs with controlled haste that stopped just short of running. At the second-floor landing, voices echoed from below, guards returning to their posts, discussing the false alarm that had pulled them from comfortable positions to investigate shadows in the snow. Arya grabbed Elias's arm and pulled him sideways into a narrow alcove barely large enough for one person, let alone 2. They pressed together in darkness, her scarred face inches from his. Both of them controlling their breathing to silence as boots tramped past their hiding spot. The guards were complaining about wasted effort, about commanders who panicked at every report from nervous sentries about the cold that made standing watch miserable regardless of actual threats. The voices faded upward as guards climbed toward their tower posts. Arya waited another 30 seconds, then released Elias and stepped from the alcove with careful quiet. They moved separately after that, taking different routes back to their quarters, avoiding the appearance of coordination that might raise questions if observed. Elias reached his room as dawn began lightening the eastern sky, exhaustion pulling at muscles pushed too hard over too many hours. But he couldn't sleep. Not with the evidence burning in his mind, not with the knowledge that his father's murder was just one piece of a conspiracy that had killed 10 people and corrupted the entire kingdom's justice system. He spent the pre-dawn hours transcribing his mental photographs onto parchment, recreating documents from memory with the precision his father had trained into him. The work required intense concentration, calling up images and translating them into written form without allowing fatigue to introduce errors. By the time morning bells rang, he had complete copies of the most damning evidence, pages that would prove Victor Ravenscar's systematic manipulation of royal justice. Training the Third Company felt surreal after the night's discoveries. Elias moved through the motions, automatically drilling soldiers and formations his body knew without conscious thought, while his mind cataloged the evidence and planned next steps. He needed to get these documents to Garrett, coordinate their strategy for confronting Victor, prepare for the political explosion that would follow when they exposed a conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of government. But something nagged at him, an instinct developed over years of intelligence work. The timing felt wrong. The real border alert happening exactly when Garrett had fabricated a fake one, forcing them to rush the archive infiltration and potentially make mistakes. Coincidence was possible, but in Elias's experience, convenient coincidences usually masked enemy action. What if Victor knew about the investigation? What if the border alert had been staged by him, designed to create time pressure and force errors? If Victor suspected something, he might be moving his own pieces, preparing countermeasures, positioning himself to strike first before they could gather enough evidence to act against him. The thought made Elias's combat instincts scream warnings. They'd been operating under the assumption that Victor didn't know he was being investigated, that they had time to build an airtight case before making accusations. But if Victor was aware and moving against them, then every hour of delay gave him opportunity to destroy evidence, eliminate witnesses, or simply disappear with enough stolen gold to fund a comfortable exile. He needed to talk to Garrett immediately, the war room consultation that couldn't wait for evening meetings or midnight conferences. But castle routine made that difficult. A newly hired master-at-arms demanding immediate audience with the king would raise exactly the kind of attention they'd been trying to avoid. The solution came from unexpected quarter. Mid-morning brought a royal page with summons to the war room for discussion of castle defense improvements. Perfectly reasonable, exactly the kind of consultation Garrett would have with his military commander, and conveniently timed to allow private conversation. Elias found Garrett at the familiar table covered in maps. But this time, Lord Ravenscar stood beside him, pointing at supply routes and discussing logistics with the easy confidence of someone who'd been managing these operations for years. Victor's presence turned what should have been safe meeting into dangerous performance, forcing Elias to maintain his cover while sitting across from the man he now knew had murdered his father. Captain Winters, good. I wanted your assessment of our border defenses. Garrett's voice carried no hint of the tension Elias felt coiling in his own chest. Lord Ravenscar believes we've been too focused on southern approaches, that the northern passes need reinforcement. Victor smiled with grandfatherly warmth. His Majesty tends toward caution, admirable quality, in a king less so in military strategy. We can't defend everything equally, so we must prioritize based on likely threats. The discussion that followed felt like verbal knife fight disguised as tactical consultation. Victor presented arguments with smooth confidence, backing each point with detailed knowledge of past campaigns and current intelligence reports. Elias countered with his own military expertise, carefully avoiding anything that might suggest he knew about the conspiracy, while simultaneously probing Victor's responses for signs of deception. Garrett played moderator, asking questions that seemed directed at strategic assessment, but actually created opportunities for Elias to communicate through carefully coded language about the previous night's discoveries. It was delicate work, three men having two conversations simultaneously, one about castle defense and another about evidence and conspiracy, and the fact that they were now certain of Victor's guilt. The meeting lasted 2 hours before Victor departed with courteous farewells and promises to draft formal recommendations for council review. The moment the door closed behind him, Garrett's composed expression cracked into something raw and furious. Tell me you found proof. Tell me we have something concrete that will hold up in public tribunal. Elias pulled the transcribed documents from his jacket. 10 cases over 9 years, all showing the same pattern. Your father was just the first victim I can identify, but there were others before him. Lord Pembroke's convenient death, possibly others we haven't uncovered yet. Victor's been systematically eliminating anyone who got close to discovering his treasury embezzlement. Garrett took the pages with hands that trembled slightly, reading through them with the focused intensity of someone cataloging their own failures. Each case represented a person he had executed, a family he'd destroyed, a judgment made based on lies fed to him by the man he'd trusted most. How much did he steal? Archives had treasury records going back 20 years. I didn't have time for thorough analysis, but rough estimate based on discrepancies I spotted somewhere between 800,000 and 1.2 million in gold. Elias watched Garrett's face go pale. Enough to fund small war or buy alliance with every noble house in 3 kingdoms. That's why the border defenses are undermanned, why we can't afford proper road maintenance or adequate grain stores for hard winters. Garrett's voice came hollow. I thought my father had simply mismanaged the treasury that I was dealing with inherited debt. But it wasn't mismanagement, it was theft. Victor's been bleeding the kingdom dry for 2 decades while I unknowingly covered for him by executing anyone who noticed. The weight of that realization seemed to physically press Garrett down into his chair. He looked suddenly older, the lines in his face deeper, the gray in his hair more pronounced. This was what betrayal looked like when it came from family, when it destroyed not just a relationship, but the foundation on which you'd built your entire reign. Elias felt unexpected sympathy despite his own anger and grief. He'd lost a father to Victor's conspiracy, but Garrett was losing something else, the belief that he'd been a just king, that his judgments had been sound, that the weight he carried had at least been earned through genuine necessity rather than manipulation. We need to arrest him immediately, before he realizes we know, before he can destroy evidence or flee with the stolen gold. Garrett shook his head slowly. Not yet. We have proof of pattern but no direct evidence tying Victor to the fabricated testimony or forged documents. Any competent defender could argue coincidence that Victor was simply doing his job as chief advisor, that his presence in these cases reflects normal governmental process rather than conspiracy. You're the king. You don't need court-worthy proof to order arrest. I do if I want the execution to stick. If I arrest Victor on suspicion and rumor, half the High Council will claim I'm becoming paranoid tyrant, purging advisors who displease me. They'll point to my father's reign, suggest I'm following his brutal path. Garrett's jaw tightened. I need ironclad evidence that will convince the entire Kingdom Council Church, common people, that Victor Ravenscar betrayed his oath and murdered innocent subjects. Anything less gives him martyrdom instead of justice. Elias wanted to argue, wanted to insist that immediate action was worth the political risk. But he'd spent enough years in intelligence work to recognize the truth in Garrett's assessment. Arresting Victor without overwhelming proof would create exactly the kind of public relations disaster that could undermine everything they were trying to achieve. Then we need a witness, someone who participated in the conspiracy, who can testify directly about how Victor manufactured evidence and coordinated false accusations. Lady Vivian Ashmore. She provided testimony in your father's case, described meetings that couldn't have happened. If we can break her, get her to confess and implicate Victor, she's protected by her father's noble house. We can't arrest her without cause and suspicion. About 5-year-old testimony won't be sufficient justification. They sat in frustrated silence, trapped by the same institutional processes that Victor had exploited so effectively. Every option led to political complications that could backfire catastrophically if they moved too quickly or with insufficient preparation. Finally, Garrett spoke with the cold calculation of someone shifting from emotional reaction to tactical planning. We set a trap, create situation that forces Victor to act overtly, to do something we can catch him in the middle of. Make him believe we're close to discovering something specific, panic him into making mistakes. That's dangerous. If Victor realizes we're investigating him, he might decide eliminating us is safer than running. Let him try. We'll be ready. Garrett's expression hardened into something that reminded Elias why this man had survived 3 decades of combat and 9 years of political warfare. Besides, I'm tired of reacting to Victor's moves. Time to make him react to ours. Time to see how well he handles pressure when he's not the one pulling strings. They spent the next hour planning operational details with military precision, mapping out the trap they would spring and the contingencies they'd need if things went wrong. It was dangerous work, the kind of high-risk intelligence operation that could either expose the conspiracy or get them both killed. But doing nothing meant allowing Victor to continue corrupting the kingdom, potentially for years more, executing anyone who got too close to discovering his crimes. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the war room, Elias felt the familiar pre-combat tension building in his chest, the knowledge that everything was about to escalate, that the careful investigation phase was ending, and direct confrontation was beginning. This was what he'd spent 5 years working toward, the moment when his father's murderer would finally face consequences for his crimes. But first they had to survive what came next. The trap required 3 days to construct properly. Garrett spent those days in visible frustration, calling council meetings where he questioned Treasury reports with increasing aggression, demanding explanations for discrepancies that Victor scrambled to justify. The performance was masterful, a king growing suspicious, but not yet certain, asking questions that suggested he was close to discovering something without revealing exactly what. Each meeting ratcheted tension higher, Victor's explanations becoming more elaborate, his composed facade showing hairline cracks. Elias watched from his position as master-at-arms officially present to discuss security matters, but actually cataloging Victor's responses for signs of panic. The older man maintained control better than expected, deflecting questions with bureaucratic complexity and promises to provide detailed documentation. But his eyes betrayed him, constant flicking toward exits, assessing threats, calculating whether he still had time to manage the situation or needed to cut losses and run. On the third night, Garrett made his move. He announced to a small gathering of senior advisors that he discovered irregularities in Treasury accounts dating back 15 years, that he was ordering comprehensive audit of all financial records, and that he expected complete cooperation from everyone involved in managing the kingdom's gold. The statement was carefully calibrated to sound like routine governance rather than accusation, but Victor would understand its real meaning. The investigation was closing in, and he had limited time before evidence became undeniable. Elias positioned himself on the battlements that night, wrapped in a dark cloak, watching the castle's main gate and the secret exit near the old armory that Arya had identified during her years of service. If Victor ran, it would be tonight, taking whatever portable wealth he could carry and disappearing into territory where Garrett's authority couldn't reach. Scotland, perhaps, or France, or one of the dozens of places where a man with enough gold could buy sanctuary from justice. Hours crawled past. Midnight came and went. The castle settled into deep night quiet, only guards moving on their rounds, their torches tracking predictable patterns across walls and courtyards. Elias began to wonder if they'd miscalculated, if Victor was more disciplined than expected, willing to brazen out the investigation rather than flee and confirm his guilt through absence. Then movement caught his eye, a figure emerging from the armory passage moving with purposeful haste toward the stables. Too dark to identify at this distance, but the body language screamed guilty flight rather than legitimate business. Elias descended from the battlements using the hidden stairs Arya had shown him, reaching ground level as the figure entered the stables and emerged moments later, mounted on a horse laden with saddlebags that bulged with unmistakable weight. He let Victor clear the gate before following, maintaining enough distance to avoid detection while keeping the fleeing man in sight. The route led north through terrain Elias had scouted during the previous days, anticipating exactly this scenario. Victor rode hard, pushing his horse toward the border with the urgency of someone who knew pursuit was inevitable. 3 miles from the castle, at a narrow point where the road passed between rocky outcroppings, Garrett materialized from the shadows with 20 mounted knights behind him. They blocked the path with weapons-drawn torches, turning the night into flickering orange hellscape. Victor reined his horse to a stop, face going from panic to calculation to resignation in the space of heartbeats. "Going somewhere, my lord," Garrett's voice carried across the distance with deadly calm. Victor straightened in his saddle, composure returning with visible effort. He was caught trapped between armed knights ahead and Elias approaching from behind, but he still had one weapon left: words. 64 years of political experience, decades of manipulating kings and councils, the practiced skill of someone who'd talked his way out of impossible situations before. "Your Majesty, I can explain the misunderstanding about the Treasury accounts, if you'll give me opportunity to present proper documentation." "Save it." Garrett dismounted with economical grace, walking forward until he stood within striking distance. "I know about the embezzlement. I know about the false executions. I know you've been systematically murdering anyone who discovered your theft, using me as weapon against innocent people for 9 years. Victor's mask cracked, then revealing something cold and calculating beneath the grandfatherly warmth he had always projected. "You think you know, but proof is another matter entirely. Everything I've done has been within my authority as chief advisor, documented and legal. You have suspicions, not evidence. I have 10 cases showing identical patterns of fabricated testimony and forged financial records. I have treasury discrepancies totaling over $1 million in gold. I have your signature on documents coordinating witnesses and presenting evidence in every single case. Garrett's hand moved to his sword hilt. And I have you fleeing in the night with saddlebags full of stolen gold. That's sufficient evidence for arrest, trial, and execution. Based on analysis by whom that bastard pretending to be master-at-arms. Victor's gaze flicked to Elias with sudden venom. Yes, I know who he is. Captain Elias Thornwood, son of the traitor I helped you execute 5 years ago. Did you really think I wouldn't recognize him once he started asking questions and accessing archives? The boy spent 5 years planning revenge, and now he's manipulated you into believing his father's lies. The accusation was smoothly delivered, designed to plant doubt, to fracture the alliance between Garrett and Elias by questioning motives and suggesting personal vendetta rather than legitimate investigation. Classic deflection technique, and it might have worked if Garrett hadn't already spent days preparing for exactly this response. Thomas Thornwood wasn't in the kingdom when Lady Vivienne claimed to witness him meeting with French agents. He was in Scotland with my forces. I signed his travel warrant, myself rode beside him for 2 weeks. That's not speculation or vendetta, Victor. That's documented fact proving the testimony against him was fabricated. Garrett's voice went quieter, more dangerous. You framed him. You coordinated false witnesses and forged evidence, and you made me sign the order that killed an innocent man who was investigating your theft. Victor was silent for several heartbeats, reassessing his position. When he spoke again, the warm advisor persona had vanished entirely, replaced by cold pragmatism that Elias recognized from his intelligence training, the voice of someone who'd done terrible things and convinced themselves it was justified. Yes, I framed Thomas Thornwood, and yes, I embezzled treasury funds over 20 years. Do you know why? He gestured at the darkness surrounding them. Because this kingdom was dying. Your father's brutal reign destroyed trade relationships, alienated noble houses, weakened military defenses to the point where we were vulnerable to invasion. Someone had to maintain secret diplomatic channels, buy loyalties your father had destroyed, fund intelligence networks that kept us from being conquered by France or Scotland or any of the dozen enemies your father created. So you stole $1 million in gold for the good of the kingdom. Garrett's tone dripped skepticism. I built infrastructure your father refused to fund. I paid spies who kept you alive through 3 assassination attempts. I maintained relationships with noble houses that would have rebelled if not for carefully applied bribes and favors. Victor's voice rose with conviction, born from years of self-justification. Yes, I eliminated people who threatened to expose these operations. Thomas Thornwood, Lord Pembroke, 6 others who discovered aspects of the network and would have destroyed everything if they'd gone public. I did what was necessary to keep this kingdom functioning while you learned to be king. You made me a murderer. The words came flat and final. You turned me into a weapon against my own people, made me execute innocents while believing I was serving justice. That's not protection, Victor. That's corruption of everything I've tried to build. You were 19 years old when you inherited this throne, too young and too idealistic to understand what ruling actually requires. Your father knew he understood that sometimes kings must make hard choices, must sacrifice innocence for greater good, must get their hands bloody to keep the kingdom safe. Victor's face showed genuine anguish beneath the calculation. I tried to teach you those lessons, gently guiding you toward necessary pragmatism without destroying the idealism that made you better than your father. But you're too soft, Garrett, too concerned with justice and mercy and other luxuries that kings can't afford. Then I'll fail as a soft king rather than succeed as your puppet. Garrett drew his sword, the steel catching torchlight. Victor Ravenscar, I arrest you for high treason, conspiracy, embezzlement, and murder. You'll stand trial before the High Council, and if found guilty, which you will be, you'll die on the scaffold where Thomas Thornwood died, where all your victims died while I unknowingly served your agenda. Victor's hand moved toward his own blade, then stopped. 20 knights surrounded him with weapons ready, and even his considerable skill wouldn't prevail against those odds. Instead, he smiled with bitter resignation. You'll regret this, not immediately, but eventually. When the diplomatic relationships I built collapse, when the intelligence networks dissolve, when you discover that ruling actually requires compromises you're too principled to make, you'll understand what I did and why it was necessary. He dismounted slowly, hands raised in surrender. But by then it will be too late. You'll have destroyed the machinery that kept this kingdom functioning, and you'll spend the rest of your reign trying to rebuild what you tore down in righteous anger. Knights moved forward to bind Victor's hands and secure his horse. Elias approached from behind, finally letting himself be seen, dropping the pretense that he'd been anything other than hunter tracking prey. Victor's gaze found him, showing recognition in something that might have been respect. Your father was a good man, Captain Thornwood. Loyal, honest, dedicated to justice, exactly the kind of person I couldn't allow to expose my operations. If it helps, his death was quick. I made certain the executioner used a sharp blade. No apology in the words, just statement of fact. You've spent 5 years on revenge. Was it worth it? Elias thought about his answer carefully. 5 years of exile and hardship, of planning and infiltration, of risking everything to clear his father's name and expose the conspiracy. 5 years of grief, transmuting into cold determination, of building the skills and knowledge needed to achieve impossible justice. Ask me again after you're dead. They rode back to Castle Ravencroft in grim procession, Victor bound and surrounded by guards, his stolen gold confiscated as evidence. Dawn was breaking as they reached the castle gates, pink and gold light, painting stone walls that had witnessed 3 centuries of violence and betrayal. Servants watched from windows, guards whispered among themselves, and by the time they reached the courtyard, word had spread. The chief advisor had been arrested. The king's most trusted confidant was in chains. Something fundamental had shifted in the kingdom's power structure. Garrett ordered Victor confined to the tower cells, under heavy guard, then retreated to his war room with Elias and Arya following. The 3 of them stood in exhausted silence, processing the night's events and preparing for the political storm that would follow. Arresting the chief advisor was one thing, proving his guilt to a skeptical high council and maintaining stability while investigating the full extent of his corruption would require every bit of tactical skill they possessed. The trial needs to be public. Full transparency, every piece of evidence presented for scrutiny, witnesses testifying in open court. Garrett moved to his desk, pulling out parchment to begin drafting orders. I won't give anyone room to claim this is persecution or power struggle. They'll see the proof, hear the testimony, and make their own judgment. Some council members will defend him regardless of evidence. They've benefited from his patronage, or they're compromised by association with his operations. Arya's scarred face showed tactical assessment. We need to identify them quickly, determine who was actively participating in the conspiracy versus who was merely taking advantage of Victor's corrupt system. Start with Lady Vivian Ashmore. She provided false testimony in Captain Thornwood's trial, and that requires explanation. Elias felt cold satisfaction at the prospect. Bring her in for questioning, see if she'll confess and implicate others in exchange for mercy. Garrett nodded agreement. Arya, send riders to House Ashmore. Inform Duke Ashmore that his daughter is required for testimony regarding historical trial proceedings. Make it sound routine, don't suggest accusation. If he resists, we'll escalate appropriately. The next 3 days transformed the castle into armed encampment, preparing for siege. Garrett ordered additional knights recalled from border posts, reinforced gates and walls, and made it clear through word and action that he was ready for violence if the High Council or noble houses decided to resist the investigation. The message was received. Several minor lords who'd been vocal supporters of Victor suddenly discovered urgent business in distant provinces, while others sent carefully worded letters pledging loyalty and expressing shock at their former allies' alleged crimes. Lady Vivian arrived under escort, looking defiant and aristocratic, her expensive traveling clothes and haughty bearing suggesting she expected this to be minor inconvenience rather than serious threat. Duke Ashmore accompanied her, an aging bull of a man whose martial reputation and political influence made him a dangerous opponent if he decided to defend his daughter against royal accusation. The interrogation took place in a formal chamber, with witnesses present, 2 council members, a church bishop, and scribes to record every word. Garrett presided with cold formality, while Elias stood near the door, watching Vivian's reactions to questions that grew progressively more pointed and difficult to deflect. Lady Vivian, you testified at Lord Thomas Thornwood's trial that you witnessed him meeting with French agents on August 15th, 5 years ago. Is that correct? Her chin lifted. Yes, Your Majesty. I saw him clearly meeting with two men who matched descriptions of known French intelligence operatives. Where did this meeting occur? At his estate in the garden near the old fountain. I was visiting regarding charitable organization matters when I happened to observe the meeting through a window. Garrett gestured and Arya stepped forward with documents. These are travel warrants bearing my seal authorizing Lord Thornwood to accompany Crown forces to Scotland from August 10th through August 23rd. During that entire period, he was 300 miles north of his estate, riding beside my personal guard. Multiple witnesses can confirm his presence, including Knight Commander Arya, who served on that mission. Vivian's composed expression flickered. Perhaps I'm mistaken about the date. It might have been a different time. Your sworn testimony specified August 15th. You described weather conditions, time of day, and specific details about Lord Thornwood's clothing that wouldn't be guessable. You weren't mistaken about the date, Lady Vivian. You lied under oath to help frame an innocent man for treason. Silence stretched through the chamber. Duke Ashmore's face had gone dangerously red, his hand moving toward his sword hilt before remembering where he was. Vivian glanced at her father, then at the guards positioned around the room, calculating odds and finding them unfavorable. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its aristocratic confidence. Lord Ravenscar came to me 2 days before the trial. He said the kingdom was in danger, that Lord Thornwood had discovered sensitive operations that would cause civil war if exposed publicly. He asked me to provide testimony that would secure conviction, quickly prevent prolonged trial that might destabilize the realm. So you knowingly gave false testimony that resulted in an innocent man's execution. I was told it was necessary for kingdom safety. Lord Ravenscar assured me that Lord Thornwood was genuinely guilty of the underlying crimes, that the testimony was simply theatrical necessity to ensure proper verdict. Tears began tracking down her cheeks, whether genuine emotion or calculated performance, impossible to determine. I didn't want to lie, but he made it sound like patriotic duty. Did Lord Ravenscar offer you anything in exchange for this testimony? Her jaw tightened. After several heartbeats, she nodded. 20,000 in gold. He said it was compensation for the risk I was taking for protecting me if the deception was ever discovered. The chamber erupted. Council members shouted over each other. Duke Ashmore roared denials and accusations. Scribes frantically recorded the chaos. Garrett let it continue for 30 seconds before slamming his fist on the table, Alpha authorities silencing the room through pure force of will. Lady Vivian Ashmore, you are hereby arrested for perjury, conspiracy, and accessory to murder. You'll be held in custody pending trial. He turned to the Duke, whose face had gone from red to ashen. Your Grace, your daughter has confessed to crimes that carry death penalty. However, if she provides complete testimony about Lord Ravenscar's conspiracy, names of other participants, details of operations, evidence, locations, I'm willing to consider exile rather than execution. Duke Ashmore looked at his daughter with expression mixing fury and desperate calculation. Political survival warred with paternal protection, pragmatism against loyalty. After a long moment, he spoke with voice that sounded older than his years. Your Majesty, House Ashmore pledges full cooperation with the investigation. My daughter will provide whatever testimony you require. His gaze hardened as it shifted to Vivian. And if she's been fool enough to participate in treason, then she'll face appropriate consequences. The house comes first. The Duke's abandonment seemed to break something in Vivian. She began talking then, words spilling out in desperate rush, names of other nobles who'd accepted bribes, details about how Victor had coordinated witness testimony across multiple trials locations where forged documents had been created and stored. It was intelligence windfall, confirming suspicions and revealing connections that Elias hadn't even suspected. By evening, guards were arresting 6 more nobles on conspiracy charges, raiding estates to seize evidence before it could be destroyed. The conspiracy was larger than expected, touching more people and reaching deeper into the kingdom's governance than even Garrett's pessimistic estimates had predicted. But it was also more fragile than it appeared, built on bribes and fear, rather than genuine loyalty, collapsing rapidly once the person at its center was removed. The public tribunal was scheduled for 3 days, hence giving time to organize evidence and coordinate witnesses while preventing Victor from mounting effective defense. The cathedral square was chosen as venue large enough to accommodate thousands of observers, public enough that no one could claim secret proceedings or hidden corruption. Those 3 days felt simultaneously eternal and terrifyingly brief. Elias helped organize evidence presentation, working with scribes and lawyers to build prosecutorial case that would be unassailable. Arya coordinated security positioning nights to prevent rescue attempts or assassination efforts. Garrett reviewed everything, obsessively checking and rechecking documents, questioning witnesses to ensure their testimony would hold under scrutiny. On the night before the tribunal, Elias found himself unable to sleep. He stood on the battlements watching stars wheel overhead, thinking about his father, about 5 years of exile, and planning about the justice that would finally be served when Victor faced public judgment. The satisfaction he'd expected was complicated by exhaustion and something that felt uncomfortably like sympathy for Garrett, who discovered his entire reign had been built on manipulation and lies. Boots on stone announced Garrett's approach before the king emerged from the stairwell, also apparently too restless for sleep. They stood together in silence, two soldiers watching darkness and preparing for the battle that awaited with dawn. "My father would be proud of you." Garrett's words came quiet, almost hesitant. Thomas always believed in justice and doing things properly, even when it was difficult. He would have appreciated the patience you showed, the discipline required to infiltrate and gather evidence, instead of simply trying to kill Victor and call it revenge. "I wanted to kill him, many times over 5 years. Elias kept his gaze on the horizon. "But that would have been murder, not justice. And it wouldn't have cleared my father's name or exposed the conspiracy. Some things are worth doing properly even when every instinct screams for immediate violence." "Where will you go after this is finished?" "Back to military service somewhere. Find a noble house that needs skilled commander." The question caught Elias unprepared. He'd spent 5 years focused on single goal, never considering what came after justice was achieved. Return to the life he'd built during exile. Try to reclaim some version of the future his father's execution had stolen. The possibilities felt overwhelming and strange, like trying to imagine colors he'd never seen. His Majesty mentioned needing new chief advisor, someone with tactical mind and intelligence background who isn't compromised by Victor's corruption. The suggestion came carefully casual. "Assuming His Majesty trusts me enough after everything." Garrett turned to face him directly. "I trust you more than anyone except Arya. You've proven yourself loyal, competent, and willing to put kingdom's needs ahead of personal feelings. Those are exactly the qualities I need in an advisor." He extended his hand with military formality. "Captain Elias Thornwood, I'm offering you position as High Chancellor with full authority over Treasury operations and council coordination. You'll help me rebuild what Victor corrupted, implement reforms to prevent this happening again, and serve as check on my own decisions when I'm at risk of making mistakes." Elias gripped the offered hand, feeling the calluses that matched his own, the shared markers of men who'd spent decades holding weapons. "I accept. On one condition, you allow me to implement complete financial transparency. Public accounting of Treasury operations, regular audits by independent reviewers, systems that make embezzlement impossible regardless of who holds what position." "Agreed. Build whatever safeguards you think necessary. I'm done with secrets and hidden operations. If we're going to clean this corruption out properly, we do it with complete transparency and institutional reform that outlasts both of us." They stood together watching dawn break across the kingdom, two men preparing to tear down a conspiracy and build something better from the ruins. The tribunal began at mid-morning with cathedral bells ringing across the city. The square filled with thousands of observers, nobles in silken velvet, common folk in work-worn wool, soldiers in mail, and leather priests in religious robes. Everyone who could physically reach the square came to witness the trial drawn by rumors of conspiracy and corruption reaching to the highest levels of government. Garrett presided from a raised platform flanked by high council members and church officials. Victor was brought forward in chains, his composure intact despite circumstances, face showing resignation rather than fear. He'd had 3 days to prepare for this moment, and whatever else could be said about him, Victor Ravenscar didn't lack for courage. The charges were read aloud by the kingdom's highest-ranking judge, each accusation detailed and specific. High treason, conspiracy to commit murder, embezzlement of crown funds, perjury, obstruction of justice, and systematic corruption of royal institutions. The litany seemed to go on forever, each charge representing years of criminal activity conducted under the guise of loyal service. Victor stood silent through the recitation, neither denying nor defending himself. When asked for his plea, he simply stated, "Guilty of all charges as presented, I confess freely to every crime listed and accept responsibility for my actions." The crowd's reaction was immediate: gasps, shouts, a few cheers from those who'd suspected corruption, but it lacked proof. The High Council members looked stunned, apparently having expected Victor to defend himself, to claim innocence or justification. His immediate confession robbed them of the dramatic trial they'd anticipated. But confession didn't mean explanation. Garrett gestured for silence, then spoke with voice that carried across the packed square. "Lord Ravenscar, you've confessed to crimes that warrant execution. But before sentences pass, this court requires understanding. Why did you betray the trust placed in you? Why did you corrupt institutions meant to serve justice? Why did you make me weapon against innocent people?" Victor raised his head, meeting Garrett's gaze directly. "Because you were 19 years old when you inherited this throne, Your Majesty. Too young, too idealistic, too determined not to be your father. Someone had to guide you, teach you the realities of governance, protect you from your own inexperience. By framing innocence for treason, by stealing $1 million in gold, by murdering anyone who discovered your crimes, by doing what was necessary to keep this kingdom functioning while you learned to rule." Victor's voice carried across the square with practiced projection. "Your father's brutal reign destroyed diplomatic relationships, alienated noble houses, weakened military defenses. I built secret networks to maintain stability, funded intelligence operations to prevent invasion, eliminated threats that would have destroyed everything if exposed. Yes, I crossed lines. Yes, I made you unknowing accomplice to acts you would never have condoned. But I kept this kingdom safe during transition from tyrant to idealist, and that required compromises you weren't ready to make. You're claiming your crimes were patriotic necessity. I'm claiming they were pragmatic reality. Kings don't have luxury of perfect morality. Your Majesty, you make hard choices. Sacrifice innocence for greater good, get blood on your hands to keep the kingdom secure. Your father understood that. I tried to teach you the same lessons without destroying the idealism that made you better than him." Victor's expression showed genuine regret beneath the defiance. "But you're too soft to learn, too concerned with justice and mercy and other luxuries that kings cannot afford." Garrett stood authority radiating from him with physical force. "Then I'll fail as soft king rather than succeed through your methods. I'll build kingdom based on justice and transparency and institutions that serve the people rather than enriching corrupt officials. And I'll do it without murdering innocents or stealing from the treasury or turning my government into machinery for eliminating threats to criminal conspiracy." He gestured, and Elias stepped forward, carrying the documents they'd compiled over the days of investigation. Garrett took them, holding them high so the crowd could see. "These are the original trial records for 10 executions I ordered over 9 years. 10 innocent people condemned on fabricated evidence and false testimony, murdered to protect Lord Ravenscar's embezzlement. Their names were Thomas Thornwood, Marcus Pembroke, William Stanton, Richard Blackwell, Catherine Somerset, Michael Ashford, David Lancaster, Elizabeth Moreland, James Hartford, and Sarah Westfield." His voice broke slightly on the last names. "I killed these people believing I was serving justice. Lord Ravenscar made me their executioner while keeping his own hands technically clean." He moved to address the crowd, directly making this about more than single conspiracy or one corrupt advisor. "For 9 years, I've been ruling this kingdom based on lies, making judgments, signing execution orders, trusting advisors who were manipulating me for their own benefit. That ends today. Not just Lord Ravenscar's arrest, but the entire system that allowed this corruption to flourish." Garrett's voice strengthened with conviction. "I'm implementing complete reform of our judicial and financial systems. Public trials with documented evidence, regular treasury audits by independent reviewers, transparency in government operations that makes future conspiracy impossible. No more secret networks, no more hidden operations, no more ruling through fear and manipulation." The crowd's response built gradually, first murmurs, then shouts of approval, finally sustained cheering that echoed off cathedral walls. They were witnessing something unprecedented, a king publicly acknowledging his failures, pledging systematic reform, choosing transparency over the traditional secrecy that protected royal power. Victor watched with expression mixing respect and resignation. "You'll regret this, Your Majesty. Not immediately, but eventually. When diplomatic relationships collapse, when intelligence networks dissolve, when you discover that ruling requires compromises you're too principled to make, you'll understand what I did and why it was necessary. Then I'll learn those lessons honestly, making mistakes as myself rather than being manipulated by someone who thought he knew better." Garrett returned to his seat, formal authority settling over him. "Victor Ravenscar, this tribunal finds you guilty of all charges. Sentence is death by beheading, to be carried out at dawn tomorrow. May God have mercy on your soul." Guards came forward to escort Victor away. He walked with dignity intact, head high, showing no fear of the execution awaiting him. As he passed the platform where Elias stood, Victor paused. "Your father was good man, Captain Thornwood. Loyal, honest, everything I couldn't allow to threaten my operations. His death was necessary, but I take no pleasure in it." No apology in the words, just acknowledgement. "You spent 5 years achieving this revenge. Was it worth the question?" Elias met his gaze without flinching. "It wasn't revenge, it was justice. And yes, it was worth every moment of those 5 years." Victor nodded slowly, something like respect flickering across his features, then allowed himself to be led away toward the cells where he would spend his final night. The crowd dispersed slowly, people lingering to discuss what they'd witnessed, processing the revelation that their kingdom's chief advisor had been systematically corrupt for decades. The High Council members retreated for emergency session to begin implementing reforms Garrett had promised. Scribes rushed to document everything before memory faded. Elias found himself alone on the platform as evening painted the square in orange and gold. 5 years of planning, infiltration, and investigation had led to this moment. Victor arrested conspiracy, exposed his father's name cleared. Victory felt different than he'd imagined during exile's dark nights, more complicated and less satisfying. Justice was served, but the cost had been enormous, and rebuilding what corruption had destroyed would take years. Garrett appeared beside him, and also apparently needing moment away from celebration and political maneuvering. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the square empty as darkness claimed the city. "Your father's estate has been restored to House Thornwood. Lands, titles, wealth that was confiscated after the execution, all returned with formal apology from the crown." Garrett kept his gaze on the horizon. "It doesn't undo the injustice, but it's what I can offer. Thank you. Though I'll be donating most of it to fund the reforms you mentioned, transparency systems, audit processes, whatever institutional changes we need to prevent this happening again." Elias felt strange mixture of grief and relief. Money doesn't bring him back. Making sure his death wasn't meaningless, that's what matters. "Will you stay? Help me rebuild properly?" "Already gave you my answer last night. Someone needs to ensure you don't get manipulated by the next ambitious advisor who decides corrupting the king is acceptable governance strategy." Elias managed small smile despite exhaustion. "Besides, I spent 5 years learning to be master at arms. Might as well put those skills to use protecting the kingdom instead of infiltrating it." They remained on the platform until full dark, 2 soldiers preparing for battles ahead. The conspiracy was exposed, the corrupt advisor arrested, justice served through proper institutional process. But that was only the beginning. Rebuilding government systems, implementing reforms, cleaning out remaining corruption, that work would define whether they'd truly achieved anything beyond revenge. Dawn came cold and clear. The execution was conducted with professional efficiency, Victor maintaining his dignity to the end, showing no fear as the blade fell. Elias watched from his position beside the scaffold, witnessing the moment his father's murderer paid for his crimes. The satisfaction was real but muted, overwhelmed by recognition that too many people had died, too many families had been destroyed, too much damage had been done for one execution to truly balance the scales. In the weeks that followed, Garrett threw himself into institutional reform with obsessive intensity. Financial transparency systems, judicial procedures requiring documented evidence, and multiple witnesses, regular audits by independent reviewers. The changes were comprehensive and sometimes painful, forcing nobles accustomed to privacy to accept unprecedented scrutiny of their operations. Elias worked beside him using his intelligence training to design systems that would be difficult to corrupt, building safeguards that would survive regardless of who held what position. They made mistakes, adjusted processes when implementation revealed flaws, refined procedures based on feedback from people actually using them. 5 years after the public tribunal, Castle Ravencroft had transformed into something approaching functional bureaucracy. Not perfect, human institutions never achieved perfection, but significantly better than the corrupt machinery Victor had operated. Treasury accounts showed healthy surplus, military forces were properly equipped, and trained border defenses were strong enough to deter aggression. Garrett aged into a role he'd never wanted but had learned to manage effectively. Gray dominated his hair. Lines in his face spoke of countless difficult decisions, but his judgments were sound and his reign was respected across kingdoms that had once viewed him as weak idealist, manipulated by corrupt advisors. Elias settled into position as High Chancellor, using his tactical mind to manage operations that kept the kingdom functioning. He married eventually minor noblewoman with practical temperament and sharp intelligence, and raised two sons who showed promise of becoming competent administrators themselves. On winter evening 13 years after Victor's execution, Elias found Garrett alone in the war room, reviewing maps and reports with a systematic attention that never seemed to diminish despite decades of practice. They were both gray now, both weathered by years of service, both carrying scars earned through duty rather than personal ambition. The Northern Lords are requesting arbitration for border dispute, usual complaints about grazing rights and water access. Elias set documents on the table. Nothing urgent, but it needs resolution before spring. Garrett nodded absently, still focused on military deployments along the southern frontier. We'll schedule a formal hearing next month. Make sure both sides understand that transparent process will be used, documented evidence, impartial witnesses, public record of all proceedings. They know. Everyone knows by now. Transparency isn't exception anymore, it's standard procedure. Elias moved to stand beside him at the window. We actually did it, Garrett. Built institutions that work, systems that serve justice instead of enriching corrupt officials. For now, next king might decide convenience outweighs principle, might start dismantling safeguards we built. Garrett's voice carried concern rather than pessimism. That's why we're training your sons in administration, why we've been documenting processes so thoroughly. These systems need to survive. Us need people who understand their value and will defend them when we're gone. They stood together watching snow fall across the kingdom they'd spent 13 years reforming. It wasn't perfect. Corruption hadn't been eliminated entirely, human nature being what it was. There would always be people trying to exploit systems for personal gain. But the machinery for detecting and punishing such corruption now functioned effectively, and the institutional culture had shifted toward transparency and accountability. Your father would be proud. Garrett spoke quietly, words carrying weight of years and shared understanding. Thomas died trying to expose corruption. You finished his work, implemented reforms that ensure his death wasn't meaningless. We finished his work, both of us. Elias felt the familiar, complicated mixture of grief and satisfaction that came from thinking about his father. You're the one who chose truth over convenient lies, who risked your entire reign to expose conspiracy that could have stayed hidden. That took courage I'm not certain I could have managed. You infiltrated a hostile castle, spent 5 years gathering evidence while risking execution if discovered, and helped build case that brought down most powerful advisor in 3 kingdoms. Don't sell yourself short. They remained at the window until darkness claimed the landscape, 2 old soldiers reviewing battles fought and preparing for challenges ahead. The conspiracy was long dead. Victor Ravenscar's name synonymous with corruption rather than wisdom. But his warning had proven partially prophetic. Ruling with complete transparency was harder than maintaining strategic secrets, required more effort, and generated more criticism from those who preferred traditional opacity. Yet Garrett had never regretted the choice. 13 years of transparent governance had proven that kingdoms could function without systematic corruption, that justice and efficiency weren't mutually exclusive, that trusting the people created stronger foundations than ruling through manipulation and fear. As they finally left the war room and went their separate ways, Elias felt contentment that came from duty fulfilled and purpose achieved. His father's death had been avenged through justice rather than revenge. Corrupt systems had been reformed, and the kingdom his father had tried to protect now actually functioned according to principles Thomas Thornwood had died defending. Some victories took years to achieve. Some justice required patience and discipline and willingness to do things properly even when immediate violence would be more satisfying. But the results were worth the cost. Institutions that served the people, systems that detected and punished corruption, a kingdom built on truth rather than convenient lies. The Wolf King and his chancellor ruled together for another 17 years before age forced retirement. By then, the reforms they had implemented were so deeply embedded in institutional culture that no successor could easily dismantle them. Transparency and accountability had become expected norms rather than radical innovations. History remembered them as the reformer king and his loyal chancellor who'd exposed systematic corruption and rebuilt their kingdom's governance from foundations upward. Thomas Thornwood's name appeared in those histories too, the martyr whose death inspired investigation that transformed a kingdom. Justice Elias discovered wasn't dramatic moment of revenge or single execution balancing scales. Justice was systematic reform that prevented future victims' institutions that outlasted the people who built them, and the slow, patient work of making sure corruption couldn't flourish again. That was victory worth 5 years of exile and 13 years of rebuilding. That was justice his father would have approved.